Welcome back. This is Week 8, Lecture 1, The Basic Structures of Christendom. Now, in the last lecture, The World of Charlemagne, we talked about the Carolingian Renaissance. We talked about the expanse of Charlemagne's empire. And then we also talked about the breakup of Charlemagne's empire, leading eventually to the Treaty of Verdun in 843, which essentially set the political dynamics, anyway, if not set boundaries, for the development of Europe from that point onward, even into modern times, in terms of the regions that became then quote unquote Germany, France, and then this middle region of Lotharingia. That is an overstatement because certainly there were other countries involved as we go through the development of European history. But that is, it really kind of goes back to that original breakup of Charlemagne's empire. And the tensions between France and Germany was one that we can see begins there. Now, obviously, England will become important, Spain will become important, and even some of the Scandinavian countries will have an impact, as we will see actually next lecture, and also is discussed a bit more in the written lecture for today. Because the written lecture for today is not quite the same as the lecture I'm giving now. I include in that written lecture trade, and I'll be talking about trade actually next lecture, not in this one. But I'll be referring to that lecture, the written lecture for this week, a couple of times as we go through. Now, basic structures of Christendom. This is an abstraction. It is looking at a number of different developments and saying, based on these developments, how do we come up with an understanding of what constituted Christendom? I define Christendom as a geopolitical entity defined by the boundaries of Christian worship. And we see that really emerging with Charlemagne's empire and at Charlemagne's court, with the discussions of the Christian empire and the Christian people. But then we need to go further and say, okay, if that was the case, how did that really work? What comprised this Christian empire? Now, Georges Duby, who is a very famous French medievalist, wrote a book quite a while ago now called The Three Orders, Feudal Society Imagined. And there what he did was abstract, based on legal sources, the medieval concept of the three orders. And the three orders were, one, those who fought, those who prayed, and those who worked. Now, this was a legal definition. And just as laws today don't describe actually what goes on, so in the Middle Ages, the legal codification of classifications of individuals and of actions does not reflect as such exactly what the actual actions were or how people actually interacted with each other. Just think, for example, the speed limit on I-465, I believe, is still 55 miles an hour, in some places 50 miles an hour. But if a future historian saw that and said, well, that's how people drove on I-65, we today, knowing that that's not the case, we just laugh at them. But it does get at a principle, an idea of what, quote unquote, should be. So that was what Duby meant by feudal society imagined. I'll be talking more about feudalism later on, because that was one of the basic structures of Christendom as it was developing after the breakup of Charlemagne's empire. So I just want you to realize that I'm not talking about actual chronological historical development in this lecture, but I'm abstracting and looking at some basic structures which are important to understand for understanding the rest of the Middle Ages and everything else that comes about. Into the Reformation, because that was important. Now, the three orders, just in terms of the importance here and the impact of this idea, we can't really refer to them as classes. A class of people, an socioeconomic class of people, was actually described first of all and talked about first of all by Marx in the 19th century, Karl Marx. And so there's this always is a Marxist sense of class based on economic relationships. So there's a technical definition of class. If, though, we use it in a more general term, just as like three classifications or legal classifications, because that's what these orders were, legal classifications, it works because legally, even if not until later, the 12th century when they were codified, legally people were organized or classified as being part of these orders, one of the three orders. The nobility, those who fought, the nobility, the clergy, those who prayed, and then everybody else, or quote unquote, the peasants, those who worked. Now, as we will see too in next lecture, that does not really capture and describe what was going on, and we will see tensions within that from very early on in terms of the structures. But the legal definitions or the orders are important to grasp. Now, the term order in medieval Latin referred to many different things. I'll be talking about monasticism later today, too, as one of the basic structures of Christendom. And there, too, we talk about religious orders. And I'll be talking about that even more next lecture. But we'll get there when we get there. So the term ordo in Latin, or ordines in plural in Latin, refer to different things. And so we can't just say that there's one word order, or does it mean putting things in order. It can mean that. The verb ordo, ordinare, in Latin means to put things in order. But there's also official states, and we can almost refer to translate ordo in this sense of the three orders as states. The state of being a noble, the state of being part of the clergy, and the state of being a peasant. Now, if you've had European history before, you'll see that these three orders, this concept of this threefold division of people, classification of people, was to continue until the French Revolution. The three estates in the French Revolution were the three orders, just with the estate being the French word for it. And what happened in the French Revolution, this is not part of this course, this is part of History 114, but what happened at the Oath of the Tennis Court is that the people got together and they said, we are no longer going to vote based on orders, because it used to be in Parliament in France, every order had one vote. And so the nobility and the clergy could always win over the quote-unquote peasants, which we can't think of peasants, and I'll talk about this more in this lecture and also the next lecture, as simply people who are poor working in the fields. The class or the order of peasantry was very diverse and huge because it meant everybody who was not either part of the clergy or part of the nobility. And we'll see some of those tensions again more later in the next lecture. But I just want to kind of feed forward, so to speak, and that's what we're getting at here. So the presentation here is simply to present the idea, to show the importance of it, because it was how they structured legally their understandings, and present how did Christendom really work altogether. So I hope that kind of helps set the stage, so to speak, for talking about these three orders and for the basic structures of Christendom as we go through this lecture. And again, as always, if you have any questions about any of this, just ask. And I also can refer you to the written lecture, which I hope can help clarify too. But we'll go from there. So anyway, that being said, we move along to the first slide up here, or the second slide up here, actually, namely manorialism. Now, manorialism is not the same as feudalism. Feudalism is a term, and I'll be talking more about feudalism after I talk about manorialism, and there's a reason for that, is a term that is problematic. And there's been scholars who have argued that we should not even use the term feudalism anymore because it does not accurately reflect social reality. And yet there was, at the time, feudal law that was very much part of society. And we'll see that as we go through the rest of this course as well. But I want to distinguish here two distinct systems, namely manorialism, which I define as the socioeconomic structure and system of Europe, and then feudalism, which is the cultural and political structure of Christendom or system of Christendom. Now, a manor was a cleared piece of land that was farmed. And actually, in the written lecture, I give a map or a reconstructed map of a manor. And this is why you'll see it's the social and economic system, because the agricultural production was based on a manor. And this is not like manners, like how do we act and how we get along in society. This is a manner somewhat like the manners in the Civil War in the South, or pre-Civil War in the South. These manor estates, and that was very much what was going on at this time. They could be rather small or it could be rather large. And if you do look at the map in the written lecture that's given there, and I would have included it in a slide here, I just couldn't get it to work that out technically, but anyway, you'll see that it's divided into a number of issues. So there's the cleared land area, there's the manor house, and there's the village, and then there's the manor house could also be a castle, actually, because the lord of the manor did not necessarily have to be a knight, but could be a knight. And I'll talk more about knights when I get to feudalism after this. And part of the responsibility of the knight was to protect and provide for the peasants in the village. So it was divided into strips of land, and part of the cleared land of the manor was called the Lord's domain. It's actually it's a French word, if I can get this right, DESMAINE, I think it is, domain, which meant that was the land that was the Lord's, and the Lord received all the profits from that land, and peasants would have to work on that land for a time. In exchange for those labor services, peasants were able to work the rest of the land. They were given a strip of land or so, and they could work it and reap the benefits from it. They had to pay taxes on it, though. So the Lord received all the profits from his own domain, and then received taxes from what the peasants farmed for themselves. Now, earlier on, peasants also had the right to fish and to hunt in the woods and to collect firewood. That worked really well, and we'll see later on in this course a lot of the peasant unrest and the peasant rebellions that take place in the later Middle Ages resulted from lords cracking down on the peasants. The lower nobility was being squeezed economically. And again, this is for the later Middle Ages, which I'll come back to, but I just want to, again, point towards that development to understand what's going on here. The lower nobility was being squeezed economically, and so they passed that along to the peasants. And so they stopped allowing peasants to hunt and fish. Or if peasants did hunt and fish, they'd have to pay taxes on it. Also, same thing with firewood. In other words, the lower nobility, the lords of the manor, whether it be a knight or someone else, was basically preventing peasants from being able to make a living and to support themselves. Increasing taxes that had been free, hunting and fishing and collecting firewood, and if you have to pay for your firewood, I mean, I don't have a fireplace in my house. I wish I did. It's one of the things I would love to have, but I don't. But I've seen, you go to markets and often they'll have, firewood for sale. It's, oh my God, this is so expensive. It's almost like, no, I'm glad I don't have a fireplace because I wouldn't want to spend that much on, a few pieces of wood for the fire. And so the whole issue was, fire is necessary for cooking. And so if you can go out and collect firewood, you have a ready supply of fuel to cook your food. If you have to start paying for that, and just think what happens when, oil prices rise, or, heating oil in the north, or it used to be coal, but that is a major aspect, because if people can't afford to cook their food, they are extremely limited in what they can do. So that is kind of the setting here in terms of what a manor is, how did it function, and it's going to be important because we'll see in the next lecture how this clearing of what's called arable land or farming land available for farming, beginning around the turn of the century, started greatly expanding, and new land was coming into production. But I'll be talking about that next lecture. But here's just simply the concept of the manor. Now, one of the things that the lord of the manor was responsible for was not only the physical protection of his peasants, either from wild animals coming in from the woods, or from people invading or trying to steal and rob what was there. That was the responsibility of the Lord, but also to provide for the spiritual well-being of the peasants. And every manor had a church. It's called the manor, or the manor church in the village there. And this was referred to as the proprietary church. Now, proprietary simply means it was the Lord's church. The Lord viewed it as his church. That's important. And that was going to change too, as we'll see in the next lecture or so. Because the Lord said, okay, I need to provide for the spiritual well-being and the physical well-being. And I have it there on the slides, mutual rights and responsibilities. And that was very much what this whole system was based on, both manorialism and then feudalism as well when I get there. Mutual responsibilities and rights. And the Lord had the right to the labor services of the peasants. He also had the responsibility to protect them physically and then providing for their spiritual well-being. If you view your church as your own, you provide for that church. Now, lords are not members of those who pray. They're not members of the clergy. It was their responsibility to provide a priest. Now, if a priest, let's say, died, the priest of the village church died, the parish, because a parish is simply an administrative unit, and so if it's a small manor, especially if there's not part of a larger contiguous manors, would probably be a parish in and of itself, so it would be a parish church. If the priest died, the Lord would appoint a new priest. Yes, there were bishops still, but the bishops didn't really have much to do about it. And we'll, again, get to this issue next week when it really comes into conflict in the 11th century in terms of who appoints priests, and then on the upper levels, who appoints bishops. But for here, to understand the proprietary church and to understand these later developments of conflict between the lay power and the clerical power, I'll be talking more about that later on in this lecture, we need to see it in these terms, that from the proprietary church, and proprietary just means ownership. I own this church. This is my church, and I am responsible for it, and I will appoint the priest. Now, if I'm going to appoint a priest, if I'm the lord of the manor, I don't really think about, who's the best theologically trained. There is no established theological training. It's basically, can you read Latin? So what I would probably do would go to the village and say, okay, can anybody read Latin? Who wants to be priest? And there were people who could read Latin, at least rudimentarily, because Latin is the basic language, and peasants don't go to school, and they're speaking the vernacular. But still, it's very much prevalent there. So it wasn't necessarily that you had to have specific training or institutionalized education to be able to, read the Mass, for example, because also peasants have been going to Mass for all their lives, and the Mass was in Latin. And I'll talk about the education level of the clergy later on as well, because it was actually for these country parishes, manors, very, very low. And one of the reasons is because, again, the lord of the manor would choose someone from the village. Because if someone said, I would like to be a priest, so I'd rather be a priest and farm. And yeah, I can say the Mass. Great. So he might be appointed as priest. And this whole system of choosing priests, and then by analogy, choosing bishops by the king, or the prince, upper level princes, we will see also caused problems because it led to corruption. We'll see that again next lecture. Because the whole point is a priest is supposed to serve the community. And who better to serve the community than someone from the community? So it all worked very, very well, at least at first, as it's developing. And that is the basis of manorialism. It provided the economic wealth because Europe from Charlemagne on, and even in the earlier Middle Ages, back to the Merovingians, the economic wealth was based on agricultural production. Now, I refer to trade in the written lecture, and there was trade from fairly early on, but at the time between, let's say, the breakup of Charlemagne's empire and what I'll be talking about next week, the rise of towns in the 10th, 11th century, trade was not really flourishing yet. But we'll talk about that later. So for now, the issue is the economic wealth is based on agriculture. A money economy is developing, but it's still primarily a barter system. But even though a monetary economy is emerging and taking over the old barter system. For the manor, barter was more or less the norm, at least still in the early period at this time. So when we think of how does agricultural wealth provide the basis for the economy for society, well, that's what it was. Just think of the truth. One of the reasons, in some ways, that Putin wants to get Ukraine back is not just because he felt it was rightly belonging to the Russian Empire, but also because Ukraine is like the breadbasket of Russia, of Europe. It grows a lot of grain. That's the same reason that Rome thought they should take over Carthage, because Carthage was seen as the breadbasket of Rome. So this emphasis on controlling resources, economic resources, the agricultural resources, is very important to understanding political dynamics still even into today for some reasons, or in some ways. Now, Putin also wants a port there, and so everything else, but that's another issue. The point here is, is that agriculture provided the economic wealth of the nobility, the peasantry in all its different levels, which I'll be talking more about next week or next lecture. Not next lecture, but because next lecture actually is another workshop, but lecture for week 9. And we need to realize that this manorialism was the system that allowed that to function. And that is distinct from feudalism. Now, feudalism, which I'm turning to the next slide, I have it defined as the political and cultural system of Christendom. It is, as I said earlier, a term that is difficult to use because there's a technical definition of feudalism. Feudalism, as the political and cultural system, is defined based on or it's an abstract from the Latin term feudum, F-E-U-D-U-M. Feudum is the Latin basis for the English word, English word, fief. A feudum, a fief, is a grant of land. Technically, one fief was defined as the amount of land necessary to support one knight. That is the technical definition. So that every knight, every member of the nobility needed to have a fief. But a fief was then granted by the king. Now here I'm going to just go through the structure from the top down, whereas feudalism as a system emerged from the bottom up, so to speak. So again, this is based on 12th century legal definitions, but doing it this way, I think, helps understand the system as a whole. Because theoretically, the king, or the king, owned all the land. And this goes back to the Germanic sense of the comitatus, the warrior band, and the king being the first among equals. But yet it had developed so that the king, all the land was the king's. And then the king would say, okay, I need help here. So what he would do is the king would calculate, and again, I'm making this up for illustrative purposes. So I'm just throwing this out here. Let's say here's all my territory, here's all my realm, and I need 100 knights to defend the realm. I know I can come up with 50. So what I'm going to do, where I'm going to get the other 50? Well, I'll tell you what. I'll go to my friend Bob and say, hey, Bob, tell you what, I'll give you this part of my territory to govern on your own and to, profit from on your own if you can provide me with, 25 knights. Bob said, that's a pretty good idea. And I go with my other friend John and do the same thing. So I get 25 knights from John, 25 knights from Bob, and I have 50 I can provide. So we have our 100 knights. So that works. And then Bob and John, though, and this is skipping down to a term at the bottom of the slide called subinfeudation. The land that I would grant Bob and the land that I would grant Stephen or John, sometimes I use the word Stephen, John, was called a fief. It was a grant of land, but that was far more than what was required to support one knight. Now, what is a knight technically? Technically, a knight is a mounted warrior with armor, with a war horse, with armor for the war horse, with land enough to provide sustenance for the horse and himself and his family, and squires, because once you are a knight, you need help getting on a horse when you're in full armor, and everything else. So it's a real economic unit. I often make the analogy between a knight and, in modern day terms, a tank. A tank is an individual fighting unit. It's not just whoever's driving the tank. It's a whole unit. And in some ways, a knight is that individual fighting unit, whereby a knight needs more than just himself to be able to function. Now, the knight goes into battle on himself, yes, okay, but the point is that a knight is an individualized fighting unit, not a foot soldier, but an armored warrior. Now, the example I gave in terms of granting a land to Bob and John, that land was far more than necessary to support one knight. So in the general sense, it was referred to as a fief because it's a grant of land. And there would be an official ritual granting thereof. It's called homage. Homage would be, so, okay, Bob, here's the land, but you need to come to me to court and perform homage. And homage was the feudal ritual based on saying, okay, I will become your man. And what would happen would be Bob would come and bend the knee before the king and promise his fealty and promise to give the 25 knights whenever called upon, put his hands up, and then the king would reach down, grab his hands, lift him up, having knighted him, or that's the same thing with knights at all levels, but bestowing upon him his land, give him the kiss of peace, and that relationship then was set ritually, theologically, because this was a theological aspect too, the feudal system in some ways, relationship between a lord and their vassals, which is a term you probably have heard of, but that's what this is getting at, a vassal of a lord, was similar to what was being taught and preached to people, that is the relationship between God and human beings. So we are vassals of God. That was the ritual of homage, performing homage. Loyalty, fealty. Those are the two things. Fealty is just keeping faith. Loyalty is being loyal. It was involved in this grant of land. And response, again, is rights and privileges. So Bob and John would have the right to profit from their land that had been given them by me, the king, because technically I owned all the land, just as technically God owns everything. That will come up later, perhaps. But anyway, so that is what this was. It was taken very seriously. I mean, rituals have meaning. But then Bob and John would say, you know what? Bob would say, I can come up with maybe 15 knights I know of. Where am I going to get the other 10? So he has a couple friends, Stephen and William. This is, okay, Stephen, I'll give you part of, it's my land, if you can provide me with 5 knights when needed. And William would say, sounds good. And they would do the same thing with Stephen and said, okay, 5 knights. So I have 5 and 5 in my 15. That's my 25. So I'm all good to go. That's the process of subinfeudation. And so John or Bob at that level would be if I'm the king, would be my vassal. Yet would be the lord of William and Stephen. So it can be kind of confusing in terms of the terms and the relationships, because Stephen or John and Bob, my vassals immediately, then were the lords of their vassals, who were their vassals, even though technically their vassals were also my vassals. And the problems came in when these lower level vassals, Stephen and William with the 5 knights, let's say, made agreements with 2 different kings or 2 different princes. So they became the man of 2 different people. So if those 2 different lords went to war, both called up their vassals' knights, and there was a conflict there. That was a problem. A disloyal vassal was punishable by death by feudal law. It was a rebellion that had to be put down. And we'll see that later on too. In the political theory, when we get to the 14th century, some of the political conflicts of the 14th century. But that was what kind of the basic structure of what was going on and how it all worked together. It was based on mutual responsibility, based on a ritualized, let's say almost Christianized, theologized sanctioning of this system, which culminated in the king and could include big princes. And so in this sense, as we'll see shortly, this feudal hierarchy that we talk about culminated in the emperor, because technically even the king of France was technically a vassal of the emperor. King of England was a vassal, technically. Practically, no. But theoretically it was. And that theoretical structure had major impact, as we will see as we go forward. But this, again, is the basic structure I want to get across in terms of what feudalism is. But I think you can see that why I call it the political and cultural system of Europe. I'm not talking about necessarily culture in terms of high culture or low culture, even though it's that, because every prince has a court. And court culture became extremely important. Now, just as the lord of the manor viewed himself as responsible for his peasants' physical well-being and spiritual well-being, so did these upper-level vassals, as the king himself, view themselves responsible for their subjects, spiritually and physically. The same relationship was there. You say, well, isn't that then all part of one thing? I said, yes, in one way, but no, we need to make that distinction between feudalism and manorialism. So I want you to know the definitions that feudalism was the political and cultural system of Christendom, and manorialism was the social and economic system of Christendom. And that's how it all kind of worked together. Now, I hope that kind of helps. If it doesn't, just let me know. I can go over it again. Just send me an email. Now, I just referred to this hierarchy. The problem was, within Christendom, there were actually 2 competing hierarchies. The lay hierarchy of kings and vassals, and then the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Now, these became blurred, but I'm just going to go through these somewhat briefly here. The ecclesiastical hierarchy and the lay hierarchy. I have it here, the next slide, putting them back side by side. For the ecclesiastical hierarchy, we're talking about the clergy. At the top of the hierarchy was God. No one questioned that. And then underneath God was the Pope, who was helped and advised by the College of Cardinals. And then we have archbishops, bishops, priests, and the people. In that there's this hierarchical structure. Cardinals is a long story. They began by being the cardinal priests of Rome, of the 7 churches in Rome. Cardinal being like primary first, most important. But then the College of Cardinals was college as a grouping, started expanding a bit, and then in the later Middle Ages did even more so, which I'll get to when we get through there. But anyone could be a cardinal, or any ordained person could be a cardinal. You could have cardinal priests, cardinal bishops, cardinal archbishops, simply whom the Pope appointed as cardinal, as kind of the advisors. And the College of Cardinals then elected the new pope when a pope died. And that is a key factor to both of these hierarchies because the pope was an elected office. And we'll see in a moment that the emperor was an elected office. Now, as pope, archbishops are underneath me. Archbishops are a bishop in charge of an archdiocese. A bishop is in charge of a diocese, and then there are priests and then everybody else. The difference between the clergy and the laity was the sacrament of ordination. The sacrament of ordination. I'm talking about when the sacraments get codified. They don't get codified until the early 13th century, but it was still seen early on as a sacrament. Is what makes you a priest, basically. But you can also be ordained as a deacon. There's lower orders, as called. But this is the ordo of those who prayed, which consists of numerous subdivisions. So to become a priest, when you are ordained, go through the ritual of ordination. That ritual changes your soul. Just as baptism changes your soul. I'll be talking about the sacramental system shortly. The process and the ritual of ordination impresses on your soul what they call a character. Now, that's a Latin word that we've just anglicized as character. But what its meaning is really a character is the imprint in clay. So we have a seal and a stamp, boom. The character is that imprint that's left in the clay. And that cannot be taken away. That enables the priest to effect the sacraments. I'll be talking more about the sacraments shortly. And it stays with the priest. The priest can be fired, can be defrocked. But that character, which enables the priest to celebrate the sacraments, most of all, the Eucharist, which is the celebration of Mass whereby the elements of bread and wine become actually physically the body and blood of Christ. That is a miracle. We'll be talking more about that as we go through things. A simple parish priest of a manor, who can be selected by the Lord of the manor, but cannot be ordained by the Lord of the manor. The bishop has to ordain priests. Simple parish priests could go to the same Mass as they would in every manor. And at the words of elevation, or the words of institution, elevation, hocus corpus meum, this is my body, and this is my blood. The bell rings, ding-a-ling-a-ling. And that's the point of transformation. It would not be defined as transubstantiation until the 13th century, but I'll talk about that. But even early on, it was debated about what really goes on in the Eucharist. What are the elements? And the idea was that somehow the bread and the wine become physically, actually Christ's body and blood. A simple parish priest could bring that about. The emperor himself could go into a church and say Mass perfectly, and at the words of institution, hoc est corpus meum, nothing would happen. There'd be no ding-a-ling-a-ling on the bell. No transformation would take place. That is the basis of ecclesiastical power, the ability to affect the sacraments. Baptism, that's a little bit different because technically anybody can baptize, but traditionally only a priest needs to be baptized except in cases of extreme emergency. That affects the status of your soul and therefore your eternal salvation. Now, this is all a system based on belief. We've talked about belief. If you believe it, it works. If you don't, how can you prove it? You can't prove it or can't disprove it. But when you're in a society based on belief, it's important. So if you don't believe it, you're excluded from that society. Anyway, and we'll talk more about that as we go through too. But that is the basis for this clerical power. Often you'll see or read about, probably also in your textbook, I didn't go back and check, talking about the conflict between church and state in the Middle Ages. I get so upset by that because there was absolutely no conflict between church and state in the Middle Ages. as I've defined Christendom, church and state were one and the same. There were conflicts, major conflicts between lay power and ecclesiastical power, or between clerical power, the power of the ordained and the power of those not ordained. Yes, there was conflict, a lot of it, but that was not the basis for church and state. People in the Middle Ages would not have understood that distinction because they're one and the same. So I exhort you not to talk about conflicts between church and state. Talk about all you want conflicts between clerical power and lay power. And a lay person is simply someone who has not been ordained. And the emphasis on ordination and that distinction between the laity and the clergy started emerging with the development of Christianity around the turn of the century, the first century, that is, turn of the first century. We can point to that development when also the ordained had to be seen as being exclusively male. Whereas earlier, as I talked about, we had house churches kind of led by women. With the further development of Christianity, we start seeing at the turn of the first century the emergence of emphasizing the office of ordination and the ritual of ordination, and that becomes then exclusively male. That's a whole another story, but that's an important development. So that is kind of what's going on here. And I'll come back to the sacramental system shortly. I just wanted to put that up. These hierarchies are based on two separate understandings of power. And for the ecclesiastical hierarchy, is God in control of everything. No one questioned that. We have the Pope, archbishops, bishops, priests, and people. The people are not ordained, but they're part of the clerical hierarchy. You will see the connection in a minute. With the lay hierarchy, meaning of those not ordained, God still is in charge of everything. The emperor rules for God. Underneath the emperor are kings. Underneath kings are dukes, counts, and margraves. Underneath dukes, counts, and margraves are individual knights. And then the people. Now, how do these two hierarchies merge? Well, from the ecclesiastical hierarchy perspective, the lay hierarchy starts with the people, so that the priest, your almost local priest, is higher than the emperor, insofar as the power to effect the sacraments. And yet the emperor sees himself as ruling for God. Appealing to Constantine, for example, and Charlemagne. These were emperors who were in charge of everything. And the emperor views the clergy as working for him, just as that proprietary church model that I talked about. That was essential for understanding the mentality of the lay hierarchy, because for the emperor, this is my realm, Christendom is my realm, and I am in charge of everything, and these are my clergy, my bishops and archbishops, and the Pope is the head of it, of course, and the Pope is supposed to be working for me. Now, if I'm a king, I feel the same way about my own realm. So there's conflict. It used to be that the emperor referred to himself as the vicar of God, ruling for God on earth. So later, in the 12th, 13th century, the Pope starts referring to himself systematically as the vicar of Christ. That becomes an interesting shift, because then the terminology of the emperor starts changing too. I'm no longer vicar of God, I'm the vicar of justice, to ensure God's justice throughout the realm. And the vicar of Christ is the vicar of Christ. But that is a later development. Earlier, we just needed to see the structure, the basic structures of the two competing hierarchies. And we'll see this conflict as we go through the rest of the course. But if we can't grasp what these two hierarchies, we're not going to understand the rest of the development of Christendom in the Middle Ages. So let's look in, because in conflicts and overlaps is the big question that would lead to conflicts, is who ruled Christendom. who had the final say, was it the Pope or the Emperor? And that was the question. Both appealed to different arguments for themselves, the popes and emperors being in charge. We'll talk more about this when we see the conflicts that really broke out spectacularly. There have been conflicts all along, but really spectacular conflicts in the 11th century between Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV. But we'll see that when we get there in terms of when it comes down to. But what it came down to was, again, clerical power and lay power. Clerical power was also seen as spiritual power, whereas lay power was seen as temporal, this worldly power. No one questioned that the Pope had power over the spiritual realm and life in the next world. Lay power, temporal power, was like, that's in this life. And the idea, one idea, at least the imperial idea, the lay idea, is that the spiritual power should just stick to what they're doing on people's spirits and leave me alone in terms of my wars. On the ecclesiastical side, the popes would say, agreed, we are the spiritual power. But part of the spiritual power is dealing with sin. Confession, absolution is one of the sacraments I'm talking about. And so we have control and power over, who's absolved from sin, whose sins can be forgiven here on the earth. And so, Emperor, if you are waging a war against someone that we consider to be sinful, we can say stop. Now, the Emperor probably would not be the case, but we could, with kings and dukes and margraves, say, if you're fighting each other, that's sinful, we can step in and say, no, you can't do that because that is a sin. In causa peccati, as it was called, in the case of sin, we have authority. You can see the problem, because the case of sin, what constitutes a sin, was defined too by the ecclesiastical hierarchy. And so it could encompass almost everything within the spiritual realm, allowing, though, the ecclesiastical hierarchy, the princes and the popes and the archbishops and bishops and priests, to say, we're not interfering in temporal affairs. We're just dealing with sin. Before the lay hierarchy, it's like, what the hell are you doing here, telling us whom we can fight and whom we can't? That's the conflict that's going on here. And that conflict was never really resolved, and we'll see it developing throughout the rest of the course in many different ways, and how it all develops. So that if we can't understand that, we're not going to understand the rest of the Middle Ages and really what medieval Christendom was all about. This idea that everyone just blindly believed and followed what the Pope said is absolute nonsense. It was not the case whatsoever. And we'll see that when we get into some of the conflicts where emperors basically imprison the popes. When in one case in the early 14th century, Philip IV of France sends an army to basically bring the Pope back to Paris to try him for heresy. And they have to decide whether they should kill him right there or not. Anyway, we'll get there when we get there. But this idea that people didn't think for themselves, people just blindly believed what we were told, is complete and utter nonsense. Because you can see this. People are just people, but the emperor, emperor said, "I'm ruling for God. I'm in charge." And the Pope says, "No, you're not. I'm in charge." Like, can't we work together? Well, we can, as long as you follow what I say. It gets to be very complex, and the political theory that develops becomes very complex. And we'll look at that as we go through, but this basic structure, we need to have an understanding of that to understand the conflicts that we'll be talking about beginning at least next week's lecture. So I hope that helps. And as I said, the clerical power, ecclesiastical powers, were based on the sacraments. Now I have up here the sacramental system. And what is a sacrament? A sacrament is a means of infused grace. It's also defined as a visible sign of an invisible grace. Until 1215 at the Fourth Lateran Council, which I'll be talking about later, which defined this number of sacraments as being 7, There were different numerations, different discussions. Baptism was always seen as a sacrament. The Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, was always seen as a sacrament. Confirmation sometimes was and sometimes wasn't. Ordination always was. Marriage sometimes was, sometimes wasn't. Holy orders or becoming a monastic, which I'll be talking about after this, was sometimes seen as a sacrament, sometimes not. The ordination process, though, was certainly a sacrament because that was the visible sign that implanted the character on one's soul. That's changing the status of the soul. That's what the sacraments change the status of your soul. That's what was going on. And the 7 are up there, which were a frequently used list, but not, as I said, defined until 1215. Baptism, confession, confirmation, the Eucharist, ordination, marriage, and last rites, extreme unction. Theoretically, you can only partake of 6 of the 7 because either you entered holy orders or were ordained, or you got married. Last rites, you could theoretically repeat baptism. You can never repeat baptism. That goes back to the Donatist controversy, which I talked about with Augustine. Confession, you could always repeat. Confirmation, you could never repeat. Once you're confirmed, you're always confirmed. The Eucharist was always repeated. Ordination, not. Marriage, not. Last rites and extreme unction could be if absolutely necessary. But these were the 7 rituals that made salvation possible. Because without grace, no one can get into heaven. How do we receive grace? By means of the sacraments. Those were the ways of receiving God's grace. Now, there's also things called sacramentals, like holy water. When you go to Mass and you leave and you cross yourself with holy water, that's a sacramental. It's not a sacrament. The sacraments are the big ones. And you need to have sufficient grace in your soul to be worthy of entry into heaven. I'll talk more about the economy of salvation when we get into the later Middle Ages and early Reformation. But here I just want you to try to start grasping this idea, this concept, that salvation, entry into heaven, is what we're talking about. When you die, you go up to heaven. Peter would be there. Say, let's see how much grace you have in you. Is your soul sufficient for entry into heaven? Does it have sufficient grace to get into heaven? Or if not, you go to hell. Now, in the 12th century, we start having the emergence. It's called some scholars call it the discovery of purgatory. There's a third place, but we'll talk about that too when we get there in later lectures. But here, that's the means of salvation. And so if you do not partake of the sacraments, you're going to hell. Who's in charge of the sacraments? The ecclesiastical hierarchy. That's where the rubber hits the road, so to speak. And again, it's based on belief. And we'll see in some of these conflicts. Emperors would say, I don't care because you're not a valid pope, so therefore the sacraments aren't valid, and therefore to you, I don't have to follow you. But we'll talk about some of those dynamics of how it worked out in practice later. But here, again, the basic structure is important to grasp. These sacraments are the means of salvation. And no one in Europe at the time questioned the means of salvation or the fear of damnation. No one wants to go to hell. If you don't believe in heaven and hell, it doesn't matter. If you believe in heaven and hell, it does. Because what would you do to escape going to hell? A lot. We start having later vision literature of souls who had gone to heaven and hell and seen what it was like. And it goes all the way back to Plato's myth of even though the Republic was not known in the Middle Ages, in terms of the afterlife, the rewards and punishments of the afterlife. It was part of the mental structures of people in society. And it's there in non-Christian religions as well, always had been basically throughout human history. And that is what this whole structure was based on. And again, as I said, if you don't believe it, you don't believe it. You're not going to follow it. But if you do believe it, it's extremely, extremely powerful. Extremely powerful. And it was the dominant position of society. It was the dominant position of Christendom. So if you claimed, well, I don't believe this, that was not allowed. That means you're a heretic. You can infect society. That's a crime against society. Being a heretic is a crime against society, a crime against the state or the lay hierarchy as much as it is a crime against the ecclesiastical hierarchy, because within Christendom, they're one and the same. That's how this all worked together. Because salvation was at stake for everyone. You say, that's just a theological issue. Yes, but this is a society where they believed it. And we're not going to understand the development of Middle Ages, medieval Europe, Christendom, without understanding this basic structure of the sacramental system. Now, one last slide here, and that is monasticism. And I'm going to go through this quickly. I'll be coming back to it because it's important. Monasticism developed early on. Starts out, again, as a way of seeking one's own salvation. And we have what's called the early desert fathers back in the 3rd and 4th centuries who go out in the desert alone. There's anchoretic and cenobitic monasticism. And anchoretic monasticism are the hermits. The hermits would go out in the desert. And there's all kinds of fun stories about this. I'd love to teach you a whole course on monasticism. But for here, just some of the basic structures I need to get across. The hermits would go out in the desert seeking, because it's like, what do? I'm following Christ, because following Christ is the big thing. And what did Jesus do before Jesus started his ministry? He went into the desert for 40 days. That was part of the model. To be tested before you can even begin your mission. So the idea of a monasticism, of being a monk, and monk just means a single individual, monachos, was that this is for beginners, beginning Christians. That's kind of weird, but yeah, that's what the whole point was. If we are to imitate Christ, and we'll talk about the imitation of Christ later as we get on into the high and later Middle Ages, it becomes increasingly important. But for the monastic ideal, that's really, really important, is this idea that that's what we're doing, and we have to then make sure we're ready to preach. We're ready for this. And therefore, we need this training period to discipline ourselves. Now, disciplina in Latin means discipline. It can also mean education, but it also means discipline. We have the disciplines, various academic disciplines. That's disciplina. It's the same as other, going to the principal's office in elementary school to be disciplined for bad behavior. Disciplina in Latin is the Latin translation of the Greek ascesis. Ascesis is the basis of the English word, in the Latin word, to asceticism. Asceticism is disciplining the bodily urges and functions and desires to keep it according to the right path. So an ascetic, not an aesthetic, but an ascetic, was someone who would discipline themselves to prevent their bodily lusts and needs from pulling them away from the path to salvation. And this, too, is based kind of on a Greek ideal, the distinction between body and soul. There were hierases, schools of Greek philosophy, that argued that a true philosopher, who's a philosopher is someone who loves wisdom and is pursuing of wisdom, that a true philosopher should be celibate. Because if you're, thinking about whom you're going to be sleeping with and what you're going to eat and drink and all these other things, you're not pursuing wisdom, you're pursuing bodily needs. So the body and the soul, in some ways, are in conflict, even though they should work together. Well, this wasn't all Greek schools of philosophy, but that idea was there. But the idea of this conflict between body and soul, in some ways, was a very prevalent Greek idea, even if it didn't result in, therefore, we should be celibate if we're going to be a true philosopher. It's just how to deal with that. problem of body and soul. That continued with the rise of Christianity. And the idea is if I'm really going to try to do my best to seek salvation, I better give it my all. I better really learn to discipline myself. And I'm going to follow Jesus and go out into the desert. Now, that's very briefly some of the Desert Father issues. Once we get into Europe in the 4th, 5th centuries, 6th centuries, and as it develops into Christendom, the emerging Christendom, there's not really any deserts within Christendom. You have to go a long way away. But what could substitute? The woods, the wilderness. We're talking about more of clearing of land in next week's lecture. But it was very dense. The woods were very dense. And especially in the earlier Middle Ages, Europe was rather scarcely populated. Population grows. We'll be talking about that again in the next lecture. And so the idea was to be an analogy or analogous option to going into the desert was going into the wilderness and the woods. So people would go in there. Now, it had already been established back in the early Desert Fathers that even though the anchoritic life as a hermit was the more perfect life, it was also the most dangerous. So the idea was if you could do it in a group, a cenobite, you go out and live as hermits, but in a group, and it seems almost contradictory, that was a sure way to pursue your salvation. You had friends. I mean, I've often equated it to like, if you've ever tried to go on a diet, you do it just yourself. Or if a workout plan. Let's say I'll keep them both. You're going to go. I need to lose 20 pounds, so I'm going to go on a diet and I'm going to work out. Go to the gym. So I start off. I do pretty well, and then it's like I don't really feel like doing it today. Maybe I'll put it off. Who cares? And your discipline starts to falter. Now, if you are doing that and make those arrangements with a buddy or two, they'll say, "Hey, where are you? What's going on? Aren't we going to the gym today?" You'll say, "Oh, fuck, I gotta go." Okay, we'll go. That's what I'm kind of getting at here in terms of the safer Cenobitic monasticism was safer. But the question then is, how do we live together in a group, in a community? And that's where rules began to be written for how to live. And that's why Cenobitic and Anchoritic, the active life and the contemplative life, that is some of the monasticism was seen as the contemplative life, the active life, the vita activa, was seen as ministering to people. But we first have to be able to deal with ourselves. And that is where the monasticism comes in, and we have the earliest monastic rule in the West. There are some earlier Eastern rules. Is the rule of St. Augustine. There's a long story behind there. Usually you'll read the earliest rule of the West was the rule of St. Benedict. And St. Benedict was the father of monasticism in the West, but actually Augustine was. But to argue that would take us too far afield. It doesn't really matter that much. But the point is that the monks would follow a rule. These rules, monastic regula in Latin, regula. That's going to be important when we talk about developments in the 12th century next week. You followed a regula, a rule. It's also closely related to regula as ruler, and a ruler. Where are you on your ruler? Anyway, that's a long story too. It's just rules for how to live. And I can go a lot into this because the rule of St. Augustine is one of the things I study. But it's an issue of there's 7 hours or 7 times a day that you pray. They're called the canonical hours. That's how time was measured in the Middle Ages within Christendom. Church bells would ring because it also was the basis of time for churches in general. But it was a different mentality. The reason I mentioned Augustine's rule being the oldest because it's a different type of rule because Augustine was a hermit first and then became a bishop. And so it's kind of can be both. Benedict, and it's questionable whether Benedict was actually an historical figure or not, but I'll leave that debate aside. I just want you to know that, I've been persuaded by the arguments that he probably was not an historical figure. But that gets into all kinds of other issues that we can't deal with right here today. But his rule became the predominant rule used in the earlier Middle Ages, and was for these groups of monks going out into the wilderness, and this became the basis for what's called Benedictine monasticism. It is a sense of we are going to pursue our salvation. We're going to work on what we're supposed to be doing. We're doing God's work. And we're going to be doing all of this under the authority of the bishop. So the bishop would sanction these monasteries for groups of monks and oversee them. Now, there's a problem, because if you're out in the wilderness, in the woods and everything, you're not within the town. Who's going to be celebrating the sacraments for you? Who's going to be celebrating Mass? Because becoming a monk is not the same as being ordained as a priest. And by definition, the ordo monasticus, we see that word ordo again. The monastic order, which is not the same as monastic orders, but just the state of being a monastic. And legally it was defined as entering the state of religion, in statu religionis, is when you join a religious order, you're entering into the state of religion. Whereby the religious were those members who were part of a religious order, monastic order. It began as lay people. And Benedict wrote his work for lay people who wanted to say, okay, I'm going to leave society, I'm going to pursue my salvation as a monk. The bishop had to eventually give dispensation to at least some member of the community to be able to say Mass and hear confessions and so on. So they would be ordained. That's a problem, because by definition, the priesthood was distinct from the monastics. The ordo clericus was distinct legally from the ordo monasticus. When you start to have the fusion, you start to have problems of definition, and it gets all murky. And we'll see that further as we go through things. But that becomes the basis for the distinction between the regular clergy and the secular clergy. Because once you have monks being ordained, you have clergy who are monks, which just kind of is a contradiction of terms. They became known as the regular clergy, which is not our sense of the term regular. What it means is clergy who followed a monastic rule. The secular clergy were not priests who didn't believe in theological issues, but were part of the saeculum, or part of the world. They were ministering to, they lived the active life in the world, whereas the monks lived the contemplative life in their monasteries. In Latin, saeculum, especially with Augustine, meant this age, this world. And that is the basis of the term secular. And it was only much later that the term secular became distinct from being Christian. At first, simply meant following the contemplative life, or following the active life of being a parish priest, or a bishop, or a pope, or wherever you might be. Being active in society, being active in the world, rather than withdrawing from the world, as did the regular clergy. And we'll see these fusing too in next week's lecture. So it becomes kind of confusing. But these are some of the basic structures and ideas that formed some of the rest of the development. And I think I will leave it at that, with just one final note here in terms of the centers of learning and preserving of classical traditions, because these monasteries were to have huge impact and importance. We're going to talk more about that later, next lecture. Not next lecture, but next week's lecture. The next lecture is a workshop. And one of the things that they did not only was clear land, so the more monasteries you have developing, because they need to be able to support themselves, they still have to live, even if they're withdrawing from society. So they would clear land so they could have their own farming to provide for themselves. So that economic impact was essential, but also intellectual and scholarly impact. They would copy manuscripts. They would say, okay, you know what? We are going to sit here and copy manuscripts. This this starts early on. This is in, even before Charlemagne, but then during Charlemagne's realm and then after Charlemagne's realm, we have then these monasteries that become really centers of learning because they're studying the Bible. They have to be celebrating Easter. And how do you celebrate Easter? When is Easter? Easter is a movable feast. You have to watch the stars. You have to have a very sophisticated knowledge of astronomy to be able to determine when Easter is. Just think about it for a minute. We just look it up. What is the date of Easter in the year 2045? Boom, we get an answer. Because the Easter tables, as they used to be called, have all been online. The calculations are all there. But this time, none of that was available. All they had was their observation. It's pretty impressive. So these monasteries, even though they were getting away from the world, became centers of learning. And if I am a bishop, and if I need my priest, if they need some help with learning, I may say, well, go spend some time with the monks to educate yourself. Or if I'm the local lord, it's like, you know what? Being able to read documents and charters are important, at least being able to read Latin. I have my son. He's going to be my heir. I would hope that maybe he could be able to learn to read Latin, so I'm going to send him to the monks to learn to read. So they became real centers of learning. And schools, they started talking about externs. They would accept people living with them for a while, not as becoming full members of the order, but as students who were there to learn. And this is, too, a major part of the educational system the monasteries provided. And they preserved the classical heritage. So much of the classical heritage, I mean, talking about Greece and Rome, at least with Rome, because they weren't copying Greek manuscripts in the West, but they were copying Latin manuscripts in the West, was lost. What was preserved by monks who were copying these manuscripts as part of their duty, their God-given duty to pursue their salvation and doing the work of God. So at a time when the political rulers in the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th centuries could care less about, what knowledge of Cicero or of Virgil or of, Sallust or whatever was around, the monks did and copied them. It wasn't just copying the Bible, or the theologians or the church fathers, which they did too. It was also the classical tradition. And works on the liberal arts so they could figure out how to determine when Easter was, blah, 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 blah. Mathematics, geometry, central to astronomy. All of this was working together. And it was really taking place within these centers of learning, the monasteries, which were centers of individual ascesis, asceticism, of the pursuit of individual salvation, trying to become filled with enough grace, worthy of God's grace to enter into heaven. And it's like, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it whole hog because, I don't want to take any chances. That's what this was like. Now, that is the basic presentation of monasticism. We'll see how that develops. And it's important to see why are we talking about monasticism in the course of Western civilization? Because during the Middle Ages, it was central. And we'll see as we go through this, if we don't understand the basic structures of monasticism and how that ties in with the ecclesiastical and lay hierarchies, feudalism and manorialism, we're not going to understand the developments. Especially we're not going to understand what I'll be referring to as the crumbling of Christendom and the emergence of early modern Europe in the early 16th century. Martin Luther was a monk. Well, he wasn't a monk. Actually, he was a friar, but we'll get there when we get there. Anyway, that's kind of what this whole lecture is about, kind of providing some of the basic structures of Christendom as I've referred to them to understand the developments that we go further from here. So that's this lecture for today. I will be talking about other developments, not in the next lecture, which is the workshop on the term paper, but in next week's lecture, week 9, lecture 1. And we start seeing how these basic structures played themselves out in many ways, and developed and became very messy because of different developments. But we'll see that when we get there. So if you have any questions, just let me know. As always, I'm here to help. Trying to look at the written lecture this week. There, as I think I mentioned at the beginning, I talked about trade. I won't be talking about trade really until next week's lecture. But that too is part of it, because so often we think of the Middle Ages just being backwards and there's no trade and there's no interactions and there's no intellectual development, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And all of that is so wrong, so ahistorically wrong. And we'll be talking about that as we go. Okay, thank you so much, and I'll see you again. Bye-bye.